to you, what is ranked choice voting and how does it work? And how does it differ from sort of the current method of election for city council elections in Evanston?
Well, let me say how we do it right now in Evanston, which is not the same as every place, but it's similar enough that it's going to sound familiar to folks. We have the city is divided up into 9 wards. So there's 11 elected offices. There's the mayor, me, and the city clerk. We both run citywide. And then the other 9 offices are for the 9 city council members, each of whom run from their own ward. And when they file to run, the election is in April, but if 5 or more of them file to run, that triggers a special primary election that happens in February, where the top 2 vote getters move on to April. And if fewer than 5 file to run, then all of those, whether it's 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, are all running at the same time in April, and whoever gets the most votes wins. And so that means a lot of different things might happen. One thing that might happen is you've got 2 different elections, and you've got to persuade people to turn out 2 different times to make their voices heard, once in February and once in April. Another thing that might happen is you might have, let's say, 3 or 4 candidates on the ballot in that April election, and someone could get elected with, let's say 35 or 40% of the vote. And so the idea behind ranked choice voting is to say, let's not have 2 different elections, let's just have one. Let's not let anybody get elected with under half the vote. Let's say you got to get half the vote. And the way to make that happen is that the voters don't just say, hey, my favorite candidate is Daniel. They say, I'm going to rank my candidates. My favorite, let's say my favorite might be somebody else. My favorite might be Brian, but my second choice is Daniel, and my third choice is Andrew. And then when it comes time to count the votes, hey, well, if somebody gets a majority of the first place votes, they're elected already. It's a done deal. But maybe nobody gets a majority. Maybe it's a pretty close election and all 3 candidates get, around a third of the first place votes. Well, then what you do is you figure out who came in last. And whoever picked that last place candidate as their first choice now gets to have their second choice essentially count for determining who wins the election. So it's a kind of a more complex calculation, but it results in a situation where you only got to hold 1 election on 1 day, and then the candidate who is actually put in office comes in with majority support. And so there's the idea is that there's less of a likelihood of somebody really being unable to govern because they got elected with only a small slice of the community actually supporting them.
Gotcha. And does that happen often? You get a lot of people coming into office with a mandate to a small, less than 50% of their ward?
It doesn't happen that often. And one thing that was actually really interesting, so you might ask, how did this thing get on the ballot in the first place? Well, the city council voted to put it on the ballot. So that we had a vote a few months ago that said, hey, we want to put this thing on the ballot for the people of Evanston to decide whether we're going to move forward with this new system. And one of the discussions, the back and forths that happened was some folks who were a little bit skeptical said, well, now hold on. If you look at cities that have implemented ranked choice voting systems, like for instance, New York City, or we know there are examples in Minnesota, as we're going to learn about from Brian. If you look at those cities, the ranked choice voting system doesn't change the outcome that often. It's not like we're electing different people all the time. It's that there are some kind of borderline cases where it changes the outcome. And some people view that as a plus, it's saying, hey, it's not the revolution, it's just a tweak to improve the system. Others might say, hey, if it's not changing the system that much, what's the benefit anyhow? But it is important to note that you're not looking at a situation where all of a sudden 2/3 of the elections are going to come out differently. It's going to make a really significant difference in that small slice of the elections that were already typically pretty closely divided.